Today we're going to be talking about the brain, part 1. This shows the principal parts of the brain. Today we're going to be talking about the cerebral hemisphere and what protects the brain in general. Here's another image of the brain that you will have to be able to label later on. So our protective covering. We do have our skin on our scalp. We do have the periosteum, which is the outer layer of the bone, which is the skull, and it's hard for protection. Underneath that, we have the pad. We have the dura mater, we have the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, we do have blood vessels as well. And we have some cerebral spinal fluid hanging out in there as well, so that allows the brain to float. Take a closer look at the meninges, or known as the pad. The meninges has those three layers that we just talked about, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And within this arachnoid or spider-like cobweb layer, we do have the blood vessels. These three layers, again, are going to add cushion for our brain. Our blood supply is in the arachnoid layer of the meninges, and it especially circulates a route called the cerebral arterial circle, also known as the circle of Willis. We can see that right here, this circle that it flows. And the brain is about 2% of the body's weight, but it takes up about 20% of the blood supply. So we have our carotid artery that comes up and then goes into the circle of Willis. It then feeds out into the brain where it's needed most. Now, many people have heard that if you get a hard strike to your carotid artery, you can pass out. This is due to cutting off the blood supply to the brain, because if you cut off the carotid artery, you cut off the blood supply to the brain. The blood-brain barrier. These linings of cells between the actual blood and the brain have a tight junction, and it doesn't allow much through. It doesn't allow much larger stuff through, but it does allow passage of things like glucose and oxygen, and carbon dioxide, water, caffeine, and other chemicals. It regulates passages of material from the blood to the parts of the brain, and it is a barrier to most small molecules or large molecules. It prevents entry of harmful substances such as bacteria or viruses, but it also does prevent entry of antibiotics or other therapeutic drugs. So this is sort of a negative when we think about brain cancer, or if we have other diseases or things harming the brain. Trauma, inflammation, and toxins can also break down this blood-brain barrier. Also around the brain, we see our ventricles, which are cavities in the brain where the cerebral spinal fluid circulates. Now, our cerebral spinal fluid just doesn't circulate in the brain, it is also connected to our central canal around our spinal cord. It is produced in the choroid plexus. It circulates through many spaces in the brain and around our spinal cord. It is a clear, colorless liquid that contains many things like glucose and lactic acid, proteins, ureas, and different ions and white blood cells. It is a shock absorber, and it allows the brain to float. It has also chemical protection. Regulates the balance of ions responsible for neuron signaling. Also with circulation, it helps with nutrients and waste exchange between our cardiovascular system and our nervous system. Again, it just doesn't circulate around the brain, it actually comes all the way down to our spinal cord as well, and then back up. Now, talking about the cerebrum is talking about the brain. The cerebrum has 4 portions of the brain. We have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Now, the cerebral hemisphere, or the cerebrum, is paired. It has the left and the right superior parts of the brain, and it includes more than half of the brain's mass. It is made up of ridges and grooves. These ridges are called gyri for the plural, or gyrus for the singular. And the grooves are sulci, or sulcus. Another image shows different grooves that separate our different lobes. Here's another image showing the different parts of our cerebrum. Now yes, you will have to be able to label these. Now let's talk about each lobe. The frontal lobe is majority our motor area, talking about reasoning, planning, parts of speech, movement, cortex, our emotions, our language comprehensions, our problem solving, and our learning skills. The occipital lobe, which is the back portion of the brain, is mostly talking about vision. Our parietal lobe is talking about sensory areas, such as our sensory to touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. And then our temporal lobe is concerned with recognition of auditory stimuli, olfactory or smell, and memory. Here's another image that shows what is occurring on each of the lobes. Our frontal lobe, we do have speech, such as the Broca's area, and we have the motor cortex. Our parietal lobe has speech, taste, reading, somatosensory areas, and talking about all the different sensories. Our occipital lobe has mostly talks about vision. And then our temporal lobe talks about hearing, smell, auditory, sensory. Now we did say which fissures or sulci separate the lobes of the brain. Well, we see our central sulcus separates our frontal lobe from our parietal lobe. Our lateral sulcus separates our frontal and parietal from the temporal. We do have a parieto-occipital sulcus that separates those two lobes. And we do have a transverse fissure, which actually separates the whole cerebral hemisphere from our cerebellum. Now let's see if you can name those. So the longitudinal fissure is going to be all the way front to back, and that's going to be our right to left hemisphere. Now that central sulcus talked about the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Our lateral cerebral sulcus talked about our frontal and parietal separating from our temporal. Our parietal occipital sulcus was those two hemispheres, and then our transverse, again, the whole cerebrum from our cerebellum. You will need to know those. Here's another image that shows the longitudinal fissure separating the right and left hemisphere. We see our central sulcus here. Now when we talk about maps of the brain, we typically talk about right and left hemisphere and what does what, and our brain functions like a well-organized bookshelf, with different spaces allotted to different motor skills and sensory skills. Now these books must compete with each other for space. If one area or skill set must become bigger, then that takes up space from the nearest and other sensory or motor skills. So, motor skills. We like to be able to use our hands a lot, so that takes up a majority of it, but that means it takes away space from others. When we look at sensory, we tend to be sensitive on the hands and fingers, our foot, and our lips. So we see foot takes up a majority. We see that lips takes up a majority. Our tongue takes up another large section. And our hands also take up a large section. Now the structures of the cerebrum, they have different layers. We have what is known as gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is the outer layers of the cerebral cortex composed of mostly neuron cell bodies. And again, that gray matter is going to be all this pink that we see around here. And then we have the white matter, which is mostly fibers that transmit signals from one area of the cerebrum to another, or from the cerebrum to the lower portions of the brain. We also have basal nuclei, which are islands of gray matter that are buried within the white matter. And that's all I have for you for now. Have a great night.